Okay, so actually a very strange parsha, probably the most strange parsha in the book, not only because there's strange things happening here, like talking donkeys, and like I always say, thank God no one knows about this parsha because it's in the summer, so no one comes to shul. Well, some people do, but don't study it in school because they're in the summer. But it's also a strange parsha because it's not really it does from two perspectives. First of all, it doesn't advance the plot. From when the third book of the Torah, the Jewish people come onto the scene. I meant the second book of the Torah, once you move from the family to the people. It's all about the stories of the Jewish people. This is not about a story about Jewish people. It's about, it's almost like a gossip column. Happened to be there was a non-Jew who was upset at the Jews, so he hired another non-Jew to curse the Jews, and then that person, instead of cursing the Jews, blessed the Jews. But if you think about it, did the Jews even know that this happened at the time? Probably not, right? It's not really a story. It's a story about the Jews, but it's not a story of the Jewish people. It's how other people respond to them. So in that sense, like a Torah would be in a way, raising a question here, maybe the Torah would be complete without this parsha. So what does it contribute? So when you read this parsha, it's not just a question of how do I think about a specific verse and what does the story mean, but if you want to sort of zoom out and say, who needs this whole thing? What is this whole parsha telling me to begin with? I mean, it's nice to get a compliment, and it's also certainly nice to get a compliment from somebody who's your enemy, and you know it's sincere, right? When your grandmother tells you you're the best looking guy, okay, it's nice, but you know she has to say so. But when you're someone who doesn't really like you says something good about you, so it's a compliment. So it's nice that we get some compliments. But is that what the Torah is doing, just giving us compliments, or is there something deeper? So that's sort of one of the big questions about what is the function of this parsha. Um, the Jewish people may have not known about it and doesn't really advance the plot. It does. The answer is it doesn't advance the plot. We are the Jewish people at this point. They crossed the desert. They were there for 40 years. They conquered the land east of the Jordan. They are at the bank of the Jordan River, just opposite Jericho. They could really cross at any time. Now, they're not going to cross for a few months because a few other events have to happen. Not many events, though. We're almost at the end of the fourth book, and then the fifth book is just repetition, right? So the fifth book is the last 37 days of Moshe's life. And then we wait, and then after Moshe passes away, 30 days later, they cross the Jordan. They wait 3 days, and then they wait 3 days, and they cross the Jordan 30, they go cross into Israel 33 days after Moshe passes. So this is almost a few, so we're already at the destination. So now, the next few parshas, there's laws, there's things to know, things how to divide Israel, the borders of the land of Israel, very relevant information for the crossing. But this, it's a nice parsha, very poetic, but what is it really doing here? So that's just an introduction of asking a big question. And then we want to talk about the big ideas, and then we can start thinking about the beautiful, beautiful parsha. In some ways, the most beautiful parsha in the Torah, most poetic, certainly most poetic. So that's why it's a great weekend. I'm very excited to be here. Um, even though I should be excited about every parsha, but this parsha especially. Okay. But a good parsha has to be introduced with a good question. So that's by way of introduction to the introduction. Then we read the parsha in a nutshell, because that is our custom. And then we can see what we do from there. So I'm gonna read it online. I didn't print it out. Also because the printer is not here during the summer, and also because it was a pleasant surprise that Amy came. So I'm just gonna have to read it. It's very short because it doesn't do much, but okay, I'll read it. Balak in the nutshell. The name of the parsha, Balak, refers to Balak, king of Moab, and is found in Numbers chapter 22, verse 2. Balak, the king of Moab, summons the prophet Bilam to curse the people of Israel. On the way, Bilam is berated by his donkey, who sees, before Bilam does, the angel that God sends to block their way. 3 times, from 3 different vantage points, Bilam attempts to pronounce his curses. Each time, blessings issue forth instead. Bilam also prophesies on the end of days and the coming of Mashiach. So that's the fourth. So he's really 3 series of blessings plus the last one, which technically is telling the future, Messianic era. Now, parenthetically, the Torah doesn't really speak about the Messianic era explicitly, doesn't mention Mashiach explicitly. Torah has in 5 books of Moses. The prophets, of course, do many times over. But it has a few references to going back to Israel. That's explicit. But as a leader, Mashiach, who will come and transform the world, it's not explicit. The most explicit you'll get is this week's parsha in the 4th series of statements. The fourth series of statements of Bilam. So you have 3 different statements, attempts to curse that are transformed to blessing. After the 3, Balak the king says, "Go home. I hired you to curse, not to bless. So just go home." But he says, "Okay, I'm already here. I'll tell you what's going to happen in the future." And he gives the 4th. Okay. Now the end of the story seems that's the bulk of the parsha. We have a little bit at the end of the nutshell. It seems that it's an unrelated story, but according to the sages, is very much related because it's all a result of Bilam the prophet's advice. Basically, you cannot beat the Jews by cursing them. The only way to beat the Jews is to get them to do something immoral. So the Torah says the people fell prey to the charms of the daughters of Moab and are enticed to worship the idol of Peor. When a high-ranking Israelite official publicly takes a Midianite princess into a tent, Pinchas kills them both, stopping the plague raging among the people. And that's the opening of next week's parsha. Pinchas, because of his act of zealotry, he becomes the priest, which is a whole story. But for that, you have to come back next week. If that is, are you too cold in front of the AC? You could turn it off or move it. Yeah, I can move the table, whatever. Okay, go ahead, Vicky, please. That's the story in short.
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you for your earlier questions. Why do we actually need to know about what happened in this parsha, right? In light of today's events, I mean, we do have to be sensitive about how other people perceive us, right? So, and now we do know because the parsha is in the Torah.
Yeah,
so
I agree. But why? But why? Sometimes you have to do so because you have to do so because of practical concerns. We live amongst the nations. The political environment affects us. So it makes sense to be involved and know what's going on so we can protect ourselves. I'm totally open to that argument, but that argument is more of a practical argument. Now maybe there's more to that, right? Maybe that's true, but there's also more. Why? So it's important to think about how people perceive you. I agree, but that itself, you're going to ask how come. And it's interesting that this is not something that the Jewish people themselves sought out, right? It's not like the Jewish people did something, engaged in diplomacy to affect how people perceive them. Maybe they should, maybe they shouldn't, and maybe they did it elsewhere. They did it other times. Last week's parsha, they were traveling. They tried to go to their cousins, Edom. They say, "Could we come? We're nice. We're brothers. Could we pass?" They say no. They have to go detour. Then they try Ammon, Moab, all their relatives, descendants of Abraham. It doesn't work. So they are reaching out and trying to create alliances, which doesn't work, but they try, right? So I agree that they understand this, but this parsha seems to be. So I agree with you. This parsha tells you that it's important to think about how other people think about you. I agree. I'm just asking that itself, even a more fundamental question of why. Is it just a practical because that's prudent to do? It's good policy, or is it also philosophical? There's some teaching, there's some moral, and so maybe that's something to think about.
Yes, and of course it is more to that. That's why I'm looking forward to the class. But also the beginning, it kind of gives you a hint about the source of anti-Semitism because the people was frightened.
Yeah. So we talk about anti-Semitism also. It talks about anti-Semitism because there's some anti-Semitism in this picture, and the question is why. The most interesting thing about about the story is who wants to go and curse the Jews. It's not the person who is threatened by the conquest of the Jewish people, right? The Jewish people are going to enter the land, conquer the land of 7 nations. So there's people that have a territorial dispute, and Balak is the king of Moab. Moab is a nation who are descendants of Lot. Lot had two daughters, and those 2 daughters gave birth of 2 sons. We're not going to get into the story right now because it's a little interesting. We read it out in Lech Lecha, after the overturning of Sodom. They had relations with their father because they thought that everybody else would be destroyed. The bottom line is Moab and Ammon, they are the descendants of Lot, relative of Abraham. And God tells Moshe clearly, explicitly, last week's parsha, that you're not going to be able to conquer their land. That is a descent, that is an inheritance to them as descendants of Abraham. Some people say we'll get it in the end of days because there's another 3 nations that will get. It's a dispute. I don't know if it's a dispute. Some people would say that, but clearly this was not the issue right now. So there was no territorial dispute with Moab, and yet Moab, they hate the Jews so much. They want to curse the Jews. Maybe we can fight them. What are you fighting them? You have no territorial dispute. So the Jewish people coming on the scene already is making people uncomfortable. And the question is, how come? Now, some people were going to attack them, but interestingly, those people are not bothered, right? Those people, everybody, we understand we're fighting over a territory. There's no problem. Here, we don't have a territorial dispute. If you want to talk politics, I don't know if I should say this because it's being recorded, but there was a gentleman who comes to Chabad. I'm not going to name any names. That whenever anyone in Chabad tries to make a political statement, he says, "Don't do it because you're going to lose your tax exempt status, and you don't want to do that. It's going to cost you money." So yesterday I read it. I don't know if it's true because I read it on the internet. So I don't know if it's true, but I read this on Twitter. Somebody posts that in the new bill that passed, they removed that provision that a not-for-profit is allowed to engage in political activism and they can retain their not-for-profit. So some rabbi, my friend, reposts that and writes, "Yeah, no, thank you." we don't want to go this. I don't want to get political, but if you talk about the land of Israel today and talk about, in a way, the greatest danger to Israel, I don't know the greatest. I'm not an expert, but the people funding everything is Iran, and Iran has no border with Israel, right? So it's very interesting that the greatest enemy is not necessarily the enemy that has a logical dispute. Right? If you say we're fighting or you want to take my backyard, okay, I understand. I don't have to agree with you. I could think it's mine. You could think it's yours, but at least it makes sense, right? Over here, we're talking about a dispute that why are you getting involved? The other example the Torah talks about is Amalek. Amalek comes to attack the Jews. Amalek is in the south of Israel, probably southern. Well, I'm not sure exactly where they were, but south of Israel or south of Jordan, but south of what is Israel today. Today maybe parts of it is within the Israeli border because the modern border goes more south, like the cone of the map, so it goes more south than biblical Israel. But Amalek was outside the territory of the land that Israel conquered. So why are they coming to attack the Jews? Like, why are they getting involved? So in Hasidic thinking, but also broader in Jewish literature, the Amalek is the irrational hatred. There's no reason. And that in some ways is the most dangerous because you can't compromise, you can't negotiate because it's not a logical thing. So it's sort of the core of evil. He actually does talk about it. When he talks about Bilam mentions Amalek. Reshit Goyim Amalek, the beginning of the enemy of the Jewish people is Amalek. And I should say this. This is today happens to be okay. Vicky's here, so and Vicky, so talk about the Russian history, but it's really Chabad history. Today's the 12th of Tammuz. 12th of Tammuz is a big Hasidic holiday. It's the day that the previous Rebbe was released from, exile. He was imprisoned and he had a death sentence and it was converted to exile and he ended up being released at just a few. The whole ordeal ended up only being for a few weeks because it was international intervention. But the bottom line is in 1927, today he was released. And so it was obviously a terrible time for Judaism in the Soviet Union. And Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak. So today was the day he was released. So it's a big Hasidic holiday. The day he became Rebbe in 1920. His father, Rebbe Rasha, passed away in Rostov in 1920. And obviously 1920 was the revolution was 1917, but by 1920 is when the communists really solidified power. And that's when his father passed away, and that's when he took over. So obviously his whole career, his first 10 years of his career in Russia, in other words, he went right into the darkest period of history for Jewish people in Russia. But the last discourse, his father said, before he passed away, and the 2nd of Nisan was Purim, and it was a verse from this week's Parsha, Reshit Goyim Amalek, the beginning of all nations is Amalek, and basically the point is that at the core there's illogical, there's rational and irrational, and irrational is the beginning because it's subconscious. So the subconscious hate, that's what is very hard to fight. And I don't know, but maybe he was talking about, the challenges that were coming, at that time. So this week's Parsha, 12th of Tammuz, tie everything in, mention everything. Okay, so that's the introduction with the questions. There's this whole long description about the donkey, which we alluded to on Sunday. We talked a little bit about it because we talked about the donkey of Abraham. So there's this whole conversation with Bilam and his donkey. His donkey sees the angel and he cannot walk. Here in the nutshell, it's very short, but it's just drawn out and drawn out and drawn out. And it's telling us something, but what is it telling us? That's another thing we have to think about. The actual story, as a kid, I used to love the poetry, but unfortunately, the poetry doesn't begin until the fourth reading, because there's someone's introduction. The guy's dealing with his donkey. I mean, figure it out and come and get to the story. But there's this donkey, this conversation with the donkey. It's there has to be something here, is what I'm trying to say. So that is all the big ingredients, and of course, you could look at every detail of the blessings and explain what is happening here and the poetry behind it and what the message is. So we have a lot of work. But I think we want to make a few big points today, and then we'll see how much time we have for the details, with your permission. Okay, so what do we want to start with? Let's start from here. Let's look at the beginning. Page 857 in the Art Scroll is the beginning of the Parsha. And let's talk about what Balak sees, what affects him, and when he dispatches the message to Bilam, the prophet, we'll see what he tells him, and we will see, maybe that will inform what his philosophy is, and that will give us insight to his thinking. How do you know what the person's thinking? You read their emails. That's what's happening here. He sends a message to Bilam. We could see what he's thinking. We also want to discuss, I'm sorry for bringing in, just dancing all around and bringing in the big things. What is his business of curse and blessing to begin with? Like, what did he think this prophet could do? Curse the Jews. What does that even mean? So it's just some magic formula, or is there something here? What does Bilam do? What does he think he can do? And it's interesting because God says, don't go. And finally, when he says, please, keeps asking, he says, you can go, but you can't curse the Jews, only bless the Jews. So he knows that God wants to bless the Jews, yet he's pretty confident that he can still curse the Jews. He's confident he can manipulate God. And he tries all different ways, and it doesn't work. So what was he trying to do? What is the curse? And then, of course, how does this apply to our life? It's not just history. What is blessing and curse in our life? And what's the Bilam perspective in our life? And what's the transformed Bilam perspective in our life? Right? How do you find the blessing and the curse in your own life? Right? So all these things are super relevant, super interesting. Right. The only challenge is where to begin, but we begin from the beginning. So we'll read the beginning of the Parsha, and then we will see what we can do. So I'm just going to share the screen. Numbers 22.
Is there also a question of free choice here? That we have the intention to do something that I shouldn't like?
Yes. So that's interesting. It's not so much that. So the answer is that yes. You could look at it and say that Hashem has to. That Hashem is interfering with his free choice, and there is a commentary like that. I forget already who. I look at my notes, but once God says, "Don't go," but you can go, but only speak the words that I put in your mouth. Then it says God was very angry that he went. Hashem was angry that he went, and then God sends the angel to stand in the way of the donkey, and that's a very strange thing because God himself told him he can go. So why is God so angry? So everybody has to comment on that. It's just a strange story. So one interpretation I read is God is upset that he has to intervene with his free choice. In other words, God usually does not want to give people free choice, but if you're in a position of power, in other words, it's interesting. In some ways, the president of the United States has less free choice than an average citizen. Why? Because there's a verse in the prophets, I forget where, it says, Lev Mlachim v'sarim b'yad Hashem. The hearts of kings and ministers are in the hands of God. In other words, yes, you have free choice, but the more your actions are now affecting world affairs and many, many people, right? And affecting history, right? Then God is going to interfere more than, not that you don't have any free choice, but I'm just saying, you see what I'm saying? The more critical your position in life is, or your place in life is, in a way, there's going to be more involvement of the divine plan through you, because there's a lot at stake. You're not a private citizen. It's not your own moral choice. There's also a broader history. So in a way, there's some intervention. That's what some people would say. That's why Hashem is angry, because he has to interfere with free choice, which he doesn't want to do. But I can also make the argument that it's not really, because what is his skill? His skill is, what's Bilam? Bilam is not trying to speak on his own behalf. If he's speaking on his own behalf, then God is forcing him to say words he doesn't want to say. That's not what he's trying to do. He's trying to speak for God, or elicit that within God. And basically, I'll give the spoiler right now. Essentially, what the Talmud says he thinks he can do. I'm going to try to think about what does that mean. But he can basically find the time that God is angry and speak at that time, and then speak curse the Jews on behalf of God. So find the time of God is angry is also cause God to be angry. Maybe meditate about the faults of the Jewish people and get God to be angry, right? So he's very Kabbalistic in that way, how the human activity could elicit things within Hashem, right? So it's Itaruta de Latata, awakening from below. This is a Kabbalistic notion that it's not just we just receive from God, but it's a two-way street. We also can affect. So he's confident that, of course, God loves the Jewish people right now. But if you give me enough time, and if I could position myself in the right place and look at the right angle and think about the right sins, I can get them upset. And it doesn't work. His plan is frustrated, as we'll see what he says and what that means. Hopefully, we'll see. If not this year, next year. But the point is, so if you're reading it that way, God is not interfering with his free choice, because he's not trying to speak for himself. He's trying to speak for God. And he is a prophet. So a prophet is a conduit. So he's going to speak what he feels at that moment, what his inspiration tells him at that moment, what his prophecy tells him at that moment. And the sages say he's as great as prophet as Moshe. The verse says, it's a fascinating commentary by the sages. It says in the end of the Torah, never again would there stand up a prophet like Moshe amongst Israel, greatest prophet of Israel. So the sages say, oh, never again in Israel, but in the nations there has been, and that's Bilam. So he's a conduit, and he is talking the word of, and he is saying his own. He's talking the word of God. So in that sense, God is not infringing on the free choice. So that's the two ways to think about it. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen, and I'm going to read from the screen, which is the Metzudah, but you can read from the Art Scroll just as good, maybe better. In some ways, every translation is imperfect, but when you have at least two, then you could already see that then you have the better perspective. Okay. The children of Israel journeyed and encamped in the plains of Moab. No, okay, that's the chapter. It starts verse 2. Bayar Balak. Balak, son of Tzipor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. What did Israel do to the Amorites? They just conquered a major portion of land east of the Jordan, in what is today northern Jordan and southern Syria, and they conquered, or Golan Heights, and they conquered a whole section of land. And now Balak is afraid. Now, why? And Moab is afraid. It's interesting. It switches from the king to the people. There's a lot of significance here. Moab became terrified of the people, for they were numerous, and Moab became disgusted because of the children of Israel. So Moab is afraid. Moab said to the elders of Midian, now this assembly will eat up everything around us, as the ox eats up the greens of the field. Balak, son of Tzipor, was king of Moab at that time. There's so much to say about the political affairs here, but I don't want to get into that. I'm just going to say what Rashi says. Moab and Midian are always fighting. Here, Moab send to the elders of Midian. So this is what they say, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So they have a common enemy. If they have a common enemy, they get along. So that's just interesting. Okay, so what do? He sent messengers to Bilam, the son of Beor, to Petor, which is by the river of the land of his people. Which river? Probably the commentators say Aram Naharaim. This is the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. So basically, it's all the way back to Iraq. It's where Abraham came from, or Aram Naharaim. So he goes. So this is a great distance. He sends to Bilam, and he says to call him, saying, "A people has come out of Egypt, and behold, they have covered the eye of the land, and they are stationed opposite me. So now, please come and curse this people for me." This is verse 6. For they are too powerful for me. perhaps I will be able to wage war against them and drive them out of the land. For I know that whomever you bless is blessed, and whoever you cursed is cursed. So that's what he said. So we know here we have an impression of what the people think, what Moab thinks, what Balak thinks. Balak is the king of Moab, and then you have what he sends to Bilam. And then we know the story. I don't want you to go home with suspense. We know the story, so we know it's not going to work out. It's not going to be a curse. But this is a place to start, because maybe we'll get insight to what the two major questions. First of all, so we'll get insight to the two major questions. I don't want to repeat them because we said them, and there are other questions that will get to the major questions. But this will give us insight into the two major questions we said earlier. So, what is the first thing we want to think about? The first thing we want to think about is verse 5. What is interesting about this phrase? He sent messengers to Bilam, son of Beor, to Petor, which is by the river of the land of the people, to call him, saying, let's see if how the article says this. He sent messengers to Bilam, son of Beor, of Petor, which is by the river of the land of the members of his people, to summon him, saying, behold, a people has come out of Egypt. That's the phrase. Hine am yatsa mitzrayim. Behold, a people has come out of Egypt. Okay, and behold. Okay, a people has come out of Egypt, behold. Okay, I like the article better here because it says hine twice, it says behold twice. Behold, right? It says behold. Beginning of the statement in verse 5, it says, behold, a people had come out of Egypt. That's better than the translation in the Mitzuda on the screen here, where it doesn't say behold the first time, it only says behold the second time. But in the verse it says the word hine, behold, it says it twice. Right? You see, am I right? I think so, right? Behold, the land came, a nation came out of Egypt. Behold, it covered the eye of the land. Okay, so there's a lot here. What's so interesting about this? Oh, this is beautiful. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead in the second series of blessings. I'm skipping to page 867 and 867, verse 22. Now so what is that? That's chapter 23, verse 21. So I'm going to skip chapter 23. I'm going to open the Rashi, verse 21. Verse 21, what does he say? Beautiful blessings. I don't want to read all the blessings now. Verse 20, verse 22. God has brought them out of Egypt with the strength of his loftiness. That's the translation of the Mitzuda. Let's see what the ArtScrolls does. It was God who brought them out of Egypt according to the power of his loftiness. Beautiful. Let's read Rashi. Says Rashi, maybe it's in the ArtScroll, maybe not, I don't know. Let's see. 21. I don't see it in Rashi, but I'm going to read it on the screen. I don't see it in the ArtScroll. I don't think I see it in the ArtScroll. No, I don't see it, but I'm going to read it. God has brought them out of Egypt. Says Rashi, you said, behold the people coming out of Egypt. They did not come out by themselves, but God brought them out. Medrash Tanchuma Balak. Numbers Rabbah, Medrash Rabbah. So there's two places in the Medrash talk about this. What is happening here? What are we talking about? There's a big dispute between Bilam, there's a big dispute between Bilam and the response that between Balak the king and the response that God places in the mouth of Bilam, of the prophet Bilam. What is this big dispute? The big dispute is, he says, behold, surprise, a nation emerged from Egypt. What is that doing? What is that is doing is really robbing the Jewish people of their story, right? Well, how do you tell it? If I had to ask you, tell me the story of the Jewish people. You say, well, there was a family. God shows them from Aram Naharaim, from Iraq, where the prophet is from, told them to cross the desert, to go to Israel. In Israel, he said, you'll have a great nation. They'll go down to Egypt. God took them out of Egypt. God gave them the Torah. God brought them to the land of Israel, where they're supposed to fulfill their destiny, fulfilling God's mission for them. right? So there's a story, there's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end, there's a purpose, there's an overarching story. There's no mistake. They're not here by mistake. They're not random. They are part of a greater story, and they have a mission and they have a purpose. What does Bilam say? And Bilam is Moab. He's related to they're related, they're cousins. They know the stories of Abraham, right? Lot himself migrated from Aram Naharaim to the land of Israel, then went to Sodom, but okay, and then moved to southern Jordan, okay. Moved to Jordan. But he knows the stories, right? But what does he say? He doesn't want to acknowledge that there's a people and there's a story and they were chosen and God took them out and they have a divine mission and they have the Torah to teach the people how to live. He doesn't want to look at the big story. He just wants to look at what he sees before him. And he says, look, there are people who left Egypt that have a technical problem. They're here by mistake. It's random. They don't belong here. We got to get rid of them. And what does Bilam respond? He says, no, they didn't just emerge from Egypt by mistake, or behold, it happened. Behold is like, that's why I like the word behold. It's like out of nowhere. It's not out of nowhere. El Motziam Mitzrayim. God took them out of Egypt. If God took them out of Egypt, means there's intentionality, means that there's a purpose. And the story of the people is a purposeful story. So that's one big idea I want to say. I'm going to come back to it. Okay, that's one big idea. That the big dispute is there a story to the Jewish people? Are they here as part of a bigger story or not? So that's one point. Another point in that same verse where he sends to the people, which is a little poetic, the end of verse 5 on page 857. And this is very powerful. So, behold, the people came out of Egypt, and behold, they have covered the eye of the land. How does the Art Scroll say it? They covered the surface of the earth. But here, eye of the land is more precise. Kisat ein haaretz. It's more poetic. I'm not sure what it means. They cover the eye of the land. What does it mean, the eye of the land? So simply, ein haaretz could be the eye of the land. Could also mean the vision of the land. In other words, there are so many people you can't see the land, right? That's one way of saying it. There's wherever I look, I see them. I can't see the land. I just see the people. So that could be a metaphor as an expression of how many they are. Okay, so that's one way to look at it. Rashi says something else. Rashi says, what's ein haaretz? Rashi, I guess, doesn't understand like what is this metaphor, the eye of the land. So Rashi says, and this Rashi says elsewhere as well, that the people, the nations of the land of Canaan, the 7 nations that lived in what we called Eretz Canaan, the land of Canaan, they paid a tax to the kings, Sichon and Og, to the 2 kings living east of the Jordan to protect them and not allow the Jewish people passage. And that's why they weren't worried that the Jewish people are coming, or they weren't that worried because they figured they have like a superpower protecting them. But then when the Jewish people conquered the Sichon and Og, who were supposed to be their protectors, then everybody in the area really gets scared. So Rashi says, Hine kisat ein haaretz. Rashi says, let's see if the article says it here or not. I don't see it here. But Rashi says, so it's on the screen. Rashi says, Hine kisat ein haaretz. Behold, they have covered the eye of the land. Sichon and Og, who were our guardians, they attacked them and killed them. Also from the Medrash. So in other words, kisat ein haaretz, they conquered the eyes. The eyes means the people protecting. In the 6 Day War, or maybe I think it was the 6 Day War, when they conquered, in Israel, when they conquered the Hermon, which is the highest peak in the region, not really, because there's the Syrian Hermon, which they eventually lost in Yom Kippur, and then they just got it back last couple of months. But the point is that they interviewed some soldier, because there were a lot of soldiers died to reconquer it from Golani, and it just became part of the culture where this person, like after like whatever 30 hours of fighting, they said, what's so important? He said, it's the eyes of the country, because you could stand out there and see all the way to Syria. So he said, Einaim shel haMedina, it's the eyes of the country. You could see everything. So Rashi is saying the people who are supposed to keep their eyes open and protect us is Sichon and Og, and now they covered Sichon and Og. They killed Sichon and Og. So that's why they were so shaken. Like, what does it mean? So we say there's a lot of people, a lot of people is a threat. Always a lot. Many foreigners is a threat. But then there's another expression. They cover the eye of the land. So Rashi says, well, we're afraid they killed the people who were supposed to keep their eye on us and protect us. Okay, then there's a Hasidic interpretation. This Hasidic interpretation, I just read that this year for the first time, but it ties into things I said in the past. Maybe it's going to say it a little bit different. But it's a beautiful concept. And it says like this, Kisat ein haaretz. So the premise is like this. The premise is, what is Balak upset about? He's not really upset. He's not really afraid that they're going to attack his land because he knows that they're not. And this is, I alluded, I jumped over it. I'm just going to jump right. If you read verse 1 and 2, Balak, son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. Moab became very frightened. On page 857. Why does it transfer from the king to the people? Right? Balak, son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to them, right? Moab became very frightened. The answer is because the people were frightened. The king was not. Because the king knows what's going on, and he has some intelligence, and he knows what the Jewish people are planning on doing, and the Jewish people were told that they can't attack Edom, Ammon, and Moab. So what he should have done is calm the people down and said, we're not under threat. But it's always good to have people afraid. Because when they're afraid, they need the protection of the king, and they're willing to accept more power for the leader. And that's why, according to the Medrash, he knew this, he kept this a secret, and that's how he maintained his kingdom. If you look all the way at the end of verse 4, the last words of verse 4, Balak, son of Zippor, was king at Moab at that time. What does it mean at that time? We know he was the king of Moab, right? Ubalak ben Zippor melech Moab ba'itahi. Balak ben Zippor was the king of Moab at that time. Why do you have to say at that time? I know he's the king at that time. How do I know he's the king? Because it says in the beginning, Balak ben Zippor saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. Isn't he the king? Well, it doesn't say he's the king in verse 1. It just says he's the king in verse 4. What's happening here? The answer is he was not from a prominent family. He wasn't supposed to be the king. Why did they appoint him? Because everybody was afraid. And because everyone was afraid, he presented himself as the defender of the people, and therefore they gave him the job. So he knows that the people are not going to, he knows that the Jewish people are not going to attack him. He's not afraid. People are afraid. But he's happy for the people that are afraid. It's always good to have an enemy. It's always good to have an outside threat. But he's still nervous and he's still afraid and he still hates the Jews. So why does he hate the Jews so much? So here we come to more psychological interpretations. And he says he covers the eye of the land. What is the eye of the land? Kisat ein haaretz. So the Hasidic perspective says like this. People, when you're going to come and change people's perspective, when a new person, how do I say this? The Jewish people show up, and the Jewish people represent a philosophy that is so radically different than everybody else at the time, that when that is introduced to the region, people become very uncomfortable because they have to rethink everything they thought. And people don't like to be put off balance. And that's why easier than changing your own philosophy is to hate the people coming with the new perspective. What is the new perspective? What is the new perspective? Let's see with the negative side. In other words, negative for Bilam. He covered the eye of the land, the perspective of the land, the perspective of the material, of the physical. In other words, if you're the king of Moab, before the Jewish people, what is life about? Life is about, it's just physical concerns. So you want to be successful, you want to be comfortable, you want everything is only in terms of land, physicality, materialism. And that's what you're trying to achieve, and that's how you measure success, and that's how you self-define. How do I know my life is meaningful? Because I amassed enough assets, right? So everything is the perspective of the materialism. And now the Jewish people show up and they have a story. No, there's God, there's purpose. God took us out of Egypt, gave us the Torah, brought us to the land. It's not just to live in the physical world. There's a higher purpose that is expressed in the physical world. That would shake any thinking person. The masses are afraid, but the masses are not interesting. Bilam sees, he understands what's happening. And now he says, they cover the eye of the land. They messed up. Now our whole way of self-understanding, how we understand ourselves, how we understand our perspective on life has been shaken. So we don't want them here. They're going to keep reminding us that there's more to life than materialism. And then we have to actually do the work of finding meaning in our life. And we don't want to find meaning in our life. So the easier way is call the prophet. Let's get rid of that. But that is, so that is all. Now we're starting to tie things in. There's 2 points that I said so far. Number one, he denies that there's a story. He doesn't say God took them out of Egypt, because that means meaning. And we don't like meaning, because meaning means there's more to the world than materialism. So that explains the 2 parts of verse 5. Number one aspect of verse 5, he says, a nation emerged from Egypt. Not this is a story that God took them out and there's a purposeful story, is intentionality on behalf of God. No, random. They were strong, so they got out. But that he can understand, survival of the fittest, and he has no problem with that. right? But if you're going to, so that's the first thing. He's in denial, or he denies, or he's trying to deny. He's trying to tell himself, don't get bent out of shape. There's no big story here. They happened to leave Egypt. Okay, big deal. I mean, it was a big deal, but he's denying the aspect that behold means it's a big deal. It happened. So no slave can escape from Egypt. Obviously, the story made the headlines. But to say that this story represents the fact that there's a God and this mission and this purpose and this nation has a purpose, then he doesn't want to do that, because then he says, okay, so what's my purpose in this overarching story? So he doesn't want to do that. So the first thing he does is denies that there's purpose here, that is a real story, that there's intention. So he says they emerged. That's point number one. What's point number two? Point number two is, which is related to point number one, when he wants to talk to Bilam about what the people did, they covered why are they a threat to you? Why he's getting so bent out of shape? He doesn't say they're going to attack me. He says they're going to attack my surroundings. It's very interesting. He says like the ox will eat. Ata, what does he say? He says, where is it? If you look at verse 4, go back to verse 4. Now the congregation will lick up our entire surroundings as an ox licks up the greenery of the field, which is very funny, because if you want a metaphor of an animal, of a dangerous animal, you would use an animal of prey. You wouldn't use an ox eating greenery. In a way, there's no more peaceful image than that. Okay, the ox can get wild, but that's not the act. It's not a goring ox. It's an ox eating greenery, right? What could be so bad? And he's saying that our surroundings, meaning we don't have a direct threat. We are not directly threatened. So why are you paying me? Would Bilam ask? Why are you paying me to come from Iraq to Jordan, to Israel, to cross the entire Jordan just to come and curse the Jews? What are they bothering you? He says, I'll tell you what they're bothering me. They're covering the materialism of the land. They're starting to introduce morals and values, which makes me completely uncomfortable. It's going to shake up the whole society. We're not interested in that. And that's why I'm upset. And that's why you have to come here and use your mystical powers to get them out of here. So these are we're already stitching together a greater story to see the inside of what's bothering him and how the Jewish people, by virtue of them having a story, is making him uncomfortable. And that's the opposition. It's opposition to a story, because story means meaning, and meaning means purpose, means there's more to life than materialism. And if somebody who does not have more to life than materialism, and they don't want to find more to life than materialism, that story is unsettling. And that's why you're a threat, because you're unsettling. Now, I said this theme in the past because other commentaries say it in different words. Like the Kli Yakar was also influenced by Kabbalah, or a student of Kabbalah, says this in other words about Vayakutsu, about they've been disgusted, but literally means like thorns. And but I don't want to get into that right now, but it's a similar concept. If somebody else is introducing, someone else is now introducing values, it's a threat to me, because now I have to find my own values. Now, if I do, it's wonderful. That's the whole purpose. But if I don't, then it makes then it's a lack, then there's a void within myself, and the only way I can fill that is through hate, or I'm upset at the messenger. Okay, so that's starting. We still have to do a little bit more. I don't know how to connect with the big questions at the beginning. I'm not sure I remember the big questions, but hopefully we'll get to that. I want to say one more thing, and then we'll try to circle back to the big questions, because we have 10 minutes left. So what does he do? What's curse and what's a blessing? And how do you curse? And how do you get God to curse? And what's curse in our life and what's blessing in our life? So now, someone to curse, you don't have to say anything that's not true. Let's say you are who can I speak? Which profession can I speak against? Okay, the media. It's very common to bash the media. Let's bash the media. You're a journalist and you want to take somebody down. How do you take somebody down? You do a smear story. Now, does a smear story have to be right or wrong? It doesn't have to be wrong. It could be right. Doesn't matter. It's enough to destroy a person, and it's not true. Why is it not true? Because what do? You take one incident and you paint the story as this incident defines the person. You have a fault. Everybody has a fault. But if you're going to look at the fault and say this is their story, you tear the person down. And that's why the Jewish people are not perfect. I'll be the first one to say that. Moshe will be the first one to say. All he does is complains that the Jewish people from day one are questioning God. So the prophet says, I can come to any situation. I will find the negative. I will point out how the people are sinners and they did the wrong thing. I will focus on this and draw God's attention to this. And that will trigger God has been angry at the Jewish people before, that will trigger the wrath of God and we'll be able to curse. That's what a curse is. Now, instead of waiting to the end, I'll say right now, what's a curse in my own life? What do I say when I have a cursed life? Right? I'm looking at a detail and I'm saying that this defines my life. I had a flat tire. I have a terrible life. I do it all the time. I have a terrible life. And I stopped doing it when my kids start telling me I have terrible lives. I'm like, okay, dude, you got to rein yourself in here. Yeah, the flat tire is not a terrible life. I don't mean flat tire. I don't want to say what it really is. It doesn't really matter what it is, but it's something negative or silly or foolish. And you say, this defines my life. That's a curse. That's a curse perspective. Now, that flat tire could be something serious. It could be a serious threat. But again, if you define yourself by that, that's a curse. So curse is always looking at the isolated part of the story. And in fact, later you'll see that whenever Bilam cursed the Jews, Balak didn't like it, said, okay, I'm going to take you somewhere else. And it keeps emphasizing, you'll see part of the people, but you won't see all the people. If you see all the Jews, there's no curse. If you see the entire story, there's never a curse. It's always blessed. If you see part of it, you'll be able to find a curse, no problem. Now, it's true for the collective Jewish people, but it's also true for every individual's life. If I look at any isolated event, I could say they have a cursed life. If I look at the big picture, it's blessing. And if I zoom even more out to Jewish people and I look at past, present, future, that's for sure blessing. And if you want to look at what Bilam does in these 3 series of blessings, he starts with their ancestors, talks about now, then talks about the entering of the land, and then Messianic era. And that's blessing. Why is it blessing? The moment you raise the view to stories of Jewish history, in other words, that there's a story that's unfolding, and you see the big picture, I don't just mean the big events. It could be small events, but the small events are tied to a big picture. Then the downside is not a downside. The fault is not a fault. The fault is just a way to get you to overcome it. And there's a story. And in the story is blessed. And that's what he does. And so now everything is becoming connected, because everything that Bilam is doing, that Balak in the beginning is trying to do, is isolate. And isolate means they don't have a story. Now we know why he does that, because if they have a story, it means they have meaning. If they have meaning, it means I need meaning. I don't want meaning. So what do? I deny that they have a story. So it's just a mistake. They're here. Why are they here? Let them go back to Europe. You know? And therefore when he talks about them, he says, and then also he says, he doesn't like that they're introducing a spiritual dimension, because spiritual dimension is a higher dimension, right? It's not just an isolated event. And then he says, so curse, find the faults. And Bilam says, I have no problem. I'll come. God says I love them. It doesn't matter. I love my kids. Believe me, there are times that they get you upset. So he has no problem. I can get a parent to curse the kid. It's no problem for him. I could always, what does he do? Draw your attention to the problem. I'll write you a book and I'll dramatize. And again, like a journalist, they could tell a story, take one fault and tell a story and make that the totality of the person. And then I could tell myself how my life is so terrible. Why? Because I have this problem, this problem, this problem. All these problems are details. Big picture, purpose of your life. And if God forbid you're living in a terrible time and your life is so terrible and there's a Holocaust going on, so then draw it even further. Then go past, present, future, the Jewish people, and part of a larger story. And the larger the story gets, the more blessing there is for the individual, for the collective, as well as for the individual, because I am tied in to the collective. And that's what Bilam is going to do. And that's what Bilam says. He gets frustrated that God is not looking at the details. He says, God doesn't see iniquity in Israel. What does that mean? There's no iniquity. There is, but it's part of a bigger story. So if it's part of a bigger story, you don't see it. And that's how you could have blessing in your own life and in your own day. Same story. I come home at the end. How was my day today? There's always details that are good, always details that are bad. I could focus on the negative, focus on the positive. That everyone understands. But a deeper idea is the negative is part of a larger story. If it's part of a larger story, it's not curse, it's blessing. So these are, I think, beautiful ideas. Now the only question is, how do I tie it down to the beginning of why is this important to us? So part of our story is thinking about the fact that when we have a story, how does it affect the people around us? That's what I said, because we started with, this is a story of how the Gentiles see the Jews. So we have a story. It's going to make the Gentiles uncomfortable until they have to come around and see that there is a story. But it also has to make us uncomfortable. In other words, we also have to say, okay, we have a crazy story here. Sometimes we don't look at the story, we're looking at the detail. But understand that if the Jewish people have a story and God took them out of Egypt and gave them a Torah and they have mission, they have purpose, How does this affect the material side? The material side has to be covered over. In other words, you could no longer, when you read this book, you could no longer look at the earth, you can no longer look at life. You can no longer look at life as just materialism. It's going to have to shake you up. So it's going to shake up the nations, but it's also going to shake up you, the material part of you. So it's an invitation to grow more and to think about what are the ramifications of the fact that we have a story. Because sometimes we're living in the moment, we don't see the story. What are the ramifications of the fact that we have a story? That's one thing I would say. Another thing I would say is that ultimately the purpose of the Jewish story is for the rest of the world as well. So in some ways, Balak is actually, even though it's not directly involved, the Jewish people are not doing they're not the characters of the story. They're the subject of the story because it's about them, but they're not the characters of the story. In some ways, the whole purpose of the Torah is this story, because the purpose of creation is to affect and transform the entire world. And that's why it seems like it's not related, but it's in here, and we have great, and we give it all the time it needs, because this is ultimately the purpose. And that's why, just full circle, that's why it's no surprise that the most explicit mention of Mashiach, not the Jewish people coming back to Israel, because that in a way is a Jewish story. So that's in the book of Deuteronomy explicitly. You can't get more explicit than that. But the idea that Mashiach will be a descendant of David who's going to influence the rest of the world, where is that going to be? Of course, in the portion of Balak and Bilam. And in fact, when Maimonides talks about the idea that faith in Mashiach is a principle in Judaism, and he brings proof, not only is it all over the prophets, but it's also in the 5 books of Moses. He doesn't say it's in the 5 books of Moses. He says it's in the portion of Bilam. That's what he says. After Parshat Bilam, and I never explained this. What do you have to emphasize the portion of Bilam? It's the 5 books of Moses. We know where to find it, because the point is, we attribute this to Bilam because the whole purpose of the Torah ultimately is the transformation, not just of the Jewish people, but also the rest of the world. And the symbol is Bilam, who comes with intention to hate and is transformed. And ultimately, that becomes a transformation of everybody in the world, that everybody is transformed to their understanding the oneness of Hashem and peace and harmony, etc., as a result of that knowledge. So in some ways, what we started out and said, why do I even need this? The story would be complete without this parsha. In fact, I don't even know how the Jews know this parsha. Maybe Moshe, we know from Moshe's prophecy, but it's plausible that there were other such conversations in other nations that never made it to the Torah. People spoke to each other. These are two people talking in the bar, really. It's like nobody really knows. But so why is this important? But by the time you're done, it's critical, because it represents the fact that the Jewish story is not just a Jewish story, but people are going to talk about it, be influenced by it, first be offended and shaken and therefore hate, but ultimately transformed. And this is the broader population, but also the material aspect within ourselves also ultimately has to be shaken up and ultimately transformed. So that's the pitch of the big story. That we did this without even reading any of the prophecy or any of the donkey. So for that, God has to give us good health. We have to come back next year and be able to continue reading. Or you could read it this day. It's only Tuesday. The good thing about having the class on Tuesday instead of Thursdays, you got plenty of time to read it. Of course, I should mention 12th of Tammuz, the previous Rebbe's yahrzeit, the previous Rebbe instituted and really wanted everybody to study every day of the week one portion of that week. So for example, every parsha has 7 sections. So Sunday you read till the second reading, etc., etc. So Tuesday you still have time to read the rest of the parsha. And so this is just to wet the tongue or wet the toes, depending on which metaphor you like. If you like to drink or you like to go into the beach, whatever it is, all the metaphors are good. The idea is just to bring on more. Okay, that's the story in short. Comments, questions, welcome. Otherwise, everyone have a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful day in good health.